Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 209, March 10th to March 16th, 1865. Last week, we talked Lincoln's inauguration, Hugh McCulloch, and the Battle of Natural Bridge. This week, we will conduct what some have considered to be the greatest raid of the war. James Wilson is going to be going head-to-head with Nathan Bedford Forrest in Alabama. Before we do that, though, we need to talk about Jefferson Davis and an act of desperation. Of course, let's talk about some Patreon content, and here in the month of March, we've rolled out a memoir review. This would have been from a Federal cavalryman's perspective who has served in the Knoxville campaign and then moves into Atlanta and Georgia. So I think it pairs very nicely with some of these campaigns that we had here recently in 64 and then getting into 65. We've done other memoir reviews, some of the more famous ones in the past, from a variety of different sources, even John Singleton Mosby's memoir after the war he writes. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, we also have picture slideshows of modern-day battlefields. We'll be going back to that here next month, and movie reviews as well, where we will review the historical accuracy of some of the more famous movies. We just did Gone with the Wind here in January, so if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link to the Patreon in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. So, it's been some time, but remember that Patrick Cleburne in early 1864 had created a petition for blacks to serve in the Confederate service in exchange for freedom. Military service for citizenship had been a concept back in Roman times, but in many ways this was not going to be agreeable for the Southern people. We have talked before about why such a suggestion would fail, but now Jefferson Davis is going to revisit. The rationale had been on the standpoint of Cleburne that we need more manpower to compete with the Northern armies. If not in a direct combat role, then it could free up more men for the front that would help add to the ranks. This was exactly the same thing that the Union armies were doing, so it made sense. Remember, especially if we are talking about William Tecumseh Sherman, he does not use any of the United States Colored Troop regiments in a combat capacity, but rather a lot of them are being used as these support functions guarding supply lines. Famously, we had that example at Resaca where a regiment is captured and then they're forced into servitude once again, right? So they are forming that nucleus of the support functions and doing such duties as that to free up more men for the front. March 13th, 1865 would see the Confederate president signing into law a measure to bring African Americans into the ranks of the Confederacy. Originally, there had been discussion of trying to create an entire regiment, but this was refused by the Confederate government. Remember that there had been a huge disparity in the population between whites and blacks before the war living in the South, so the logic that a full 1,000-man regiment could be supplied was sound. It may be looking through a modern lens, but you might be saying, why not? Things are not going so well, even worse than when Cleburne wrote his proposal, and that was after the disaster that was Chattanooga. But I'll go ahead and also revisit some of the same concepts that we talked about when we read off Cleburne's proposal. And that is that the Confederate States of America are a huge contradiction, right? They are these free states that are coming together and they're sort of preaching states' rights, but they're forming themselves into this confederation that is answering toward a higher power. So kind of what is the point? And then what is the point even further? Because you're supposed to be protecting those rights that are threatened by the federal government. That's why you seceded in the first place. And then you are then taking essentially the bottom line issue of why you seceded in the first place. You're eliminating that So what exactly is the point, right? We've talked before about how there is this system, we have the peculiar institution of slavery in itself, but it's also really based on racism, right? And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that there is a racial superiority aspect of it that's really important for Southern culture prior to the war, of course. So then you're kind of taking that away. You're granting citizenship even, which is something that not even the federal government is really willing to do just yet for anyone who is not white. So you're kind of taking that even a step further. So that is why this is ultimately going to not be very popular and really fail. Only 2 companies were authorized and recruits raised. The commandant of Libby Prison, Major Thomas Turner, and Major Joseph Pegram would be responsible for the training of the companies. There was surprisingly a good amount of recruits that joined the ranks, a first-hand account saying that handfuls would come every day. I say surprising because unlike the 1864 proposal, in 1865 there was going to be no guarantee for freedom in exchange for service. That was one of the things that obviously they couldn't come to an agreement on. The Confederate government would move to state that it would not circumvent the laws of the individual states and only change the recruit's status if the owner was to indicate that that was their wish. Jefferson Davis could use his presidential power to override if necessary, but it does show just how set in the ways the South was. It also shows, even in this desperate stage, Jefferson Davis, in a very sharp contrast to Lincoln, he is still beholden to the southern states and really trying to appease them. So even in a situation where you probably should be using your war power to do anything that's necessary to keep your nation alive, he is still going to bend to their will. In many respects, this is one of the main reasons why they were going to lose the war from the outset. Even in desperation, there was going to be no switch in their ideology. Hopefully it is not too much of a spoiler to say that the war is rapidly coming to a close at this point, so really there's not really a whole lot left for the companies to do. They would be disbanded with the rest of the army. Curiously, there had been limited accounts of black soldiers fighting for the Confederacy in the waning days of the conflict, but these are mostly written in years afterward, so there's not really a whole lot of evidence to support them. During the retreat to Appomattox, a majority of these men were overtaken, and the Union soldiers were oblivious to the fact that they were in fact part of the Confederate Army. Many were still operating as teamsters and cooks, the support functions that they had held during the war. While this is an interesting idea, and a shift from earlier policies for the Confederacy, ultimately, it is a little too late, and double too little in the terms of progression that the southern states would probably need to be independent. So we will recount the full events of what will become known as Wilson's Raid, the Selma Raid of 1865. By this point in the war, there had already been vast amounts of territory taken by Union forces, as we have already highlighted. Alabama, so far, has seen some limited action. Remember, there had been some raids, Rousseau's and Able Straits raids, to name a few. Toward the end of the war, this state would become the focus of Grant and the Northern High Command because of the remaining manufacturing capability. A key munitions factory was at Selma. Montgomery still stood, a place that had been on the original shortlist for the Confederate capital. Remember, too, we kind of talked about how there was this thinking that Tallahassee was the only eastern state that had not seen its capital fall during the war for the Confederacy. And obviously, we talked about that when we mentioned Natural Bridge and that action that, really wasn't even supposed to even capture Tallahassee in the first place. But you still have Alabama here as the state in which you're going to have a capital that has not yet surrendered to Union forces and has kind of been in the crosshairs for some time. What was worse for the Northern forces was that while we talked about the naval action at Mobile Bay, Mobile itself was still in the hands of Southern forces. Grant would turn to 2 officers who so far had turned in at least decent performances in the war to rectify this. Edward Canby, who has been popping in and out of the narrative, would lead a corps to Mobile. From there, he would try to link up with the other wing of the operation, the cavalry under James Wilson. Wilson has been an interesting character in our stories. He has not necessarily dazzled, but like other officers, he is still a pretty good organizer and is trusted by Grant, importantly. Bliss and George Thomas would both sign off on a move into Alabama by the young general. But he would not be going alone. Remember that part of the problem around Nashville had been that Wilson needed to put together a competent cavalry corps. Over-exaggerating what would be necessary to take out Forrest, Wilson had spent the last few months arming and training his men. He had not forgotten the retreat of Hood's army either. Walthall and Forrest especially had been able to fend off the Federal horsemen, Forrest actually setting back-to-back traps for the inexperienced horse soldiers. While now trained and mostly armed with Spencers, Wilson's roughly 13,000 men would be itching to get the opportunity to move into Southern territory for the kill. Wilson also would have a very capable cadre of officers. Edward McCook, a veteran by this point, Emory Upton, who had displayed a good tactical mind in the Overland Campaign, and Eli Long, another veteran who had started the war as a junior officer in the 1st and 4th U.S. Cavalry Brigade, would be his division commanders. Brigade commanders would include Minty, John Croxton, Oster LaGrange, Edward Winslow, so a veteran force. In this command is actually Wyler's Old Lightning Brigade, so we have a good mix of battle-hardened troops as well. Batteries would accompany the divisions, manned by the Chicago Board of Trade, also veterans and capable gunners. Facing off against this command will be Richard Taylor, commanding the department, but more immediately, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Attrition has taken its toll since Nashville. Forrest still has divisions under Chalmers and Red Jackson, with familiar brigade commanders such as Wirt Adams, Frank Armstrong, Tyree Bell, and Sol Ross. Additionally, Philip Roddy would be trying to put together a brigade, Forrest envisioning a division eventually under Abraham Buford, another of his usual lieutenants. But desertions had really plagued this region, Forrest, among others, conceding to furloughs to hopefully allow for some rest and gathering of stragglers or deserters back into the ranks. That being said, though, Forrest would still execute men for desertion, understanding the need for all available men to be in the ranks. When the dust settled, Forrest would have only some 10,000 men to operate, and they would not be concentrated. Instead, they would be spread over a wide area. This was a common problem even early in the war, but Forrest and Taylor would realize that a strike at Alabama would be imminent. The problem would be that the two attacking Federal columns would be distractions. Frederick Steele, coming up from Pensacola under Canby, would draw attention, but on March 22nd, Wilson had successfully moved his horsemen across the Tennessee River and was making his way toward Selma. In some ways, this is really the common problem with the Confederacy, as mentioned, right? Especially in what we consider the West, or not the main theater, the Eastern theater of the war. They're just stretched far too thin. There's such a tough task by Albert Sidney Johnson. We talked about him all the way back at Shiloh. He needs to retain all the territory that they currently have. He needs to act defensively and offensively sort of at the same time. Don't lose Kentucky, but make sure that everything else is okay. Kentucky obviously is going to be a tough task. Don't lose Tennessee now, right? All these things are going against the Confederates. So just the overall strategy. And that's why I think also, not to go on too much of a tangent, but that's also why I think that Lee truly is the greatest general of the war, because he understands that the Confederacy can't operate under these terms that Jefferson Davis has kind of rolled out for him. So he does a good job of convincing Davis this is a good idea for some invasions in the North. So some of this offensive action could actually take the pressure off of them. I think that's pretty sound in terms of a tactical sense. But as we get into the latter stages of the war, Forrest has already done several times where he is going to take essentially nothing. His brigades are pretty often stripped from him and then given to individuals like, say, Joe Wheeler. So he is going to have to build a force that can operate effectively and operate in the manner that he would like to operate in, which, of course, he has a pretty high standard, obviously. So he's done it before. It's not going to be just an easy walkover, or seemingly won't be an easy walkover, even in this latter stage of the war. Wilson would break up his 3 divisions on the march, meeting very little resistance. Troopers would write of the desolate state that the northern part of Alabama was in. Remember that this had already been a poorer sector of the South, but also campaigning had picked over whatever the country could provide. The Confederates would scramble to try to respond to the oncoming threat, Union cavalry picking a good time to strike. By March 27th, they had reached the town of Elyton, with really no incident, other than the weather making for difficulty at times. Elyton would eventually become Birmingham, but in 1865 it would be a fairly insignificant town a little north of Selma. Selma would be a little west of Montgomery, 2 main rail lines kind of making a cross on the state, from Elyton south leading relatively straight there. A positive for the Confederates would be the general understanding of targets for the Federals. Selma was important, and so Forrest was going to start to try to concentrate his reinforcements there. In the meantime, the general destruction of infrastructure, or anything of military value, would commence. John Croxton would be dispatched to deal with Tuscaloosa, this town being one of the attendant targets of the raid. There would be mills and manufacturing there, as well as a military school that would need to be destroyed. Originally, the Lone Brigade would run into Red Jackson. Jackson was bringing his division further south to protect a river crossing. Before continuing to their objective, Jackson would dispatch 1,500 men to launch an attack on the Federal camp before Croxton could fully withdraw. Despite taking some casualties, the Federals would continue to swing around north of their objective, moving in on a now relatively undefended town. Croxton would confiscate anything of real military value, including animals, and lay waste to the school there. Destruction of Tuscaloosa would be complete, Croxton withdrawing by April 5th. While Croxton had originally been disrupted by Red Jackson's command, he'd actually distracted the reinforcements long enough to delay their arrival to Forrest. Forrest had taken over operational control, Philip Rowdy skirmishing with oncoming Federals as they made their way towards Selma. Ironworks in the meantime would be targets of destruction, Wilson making sure to try to remove the production capability of the rebels in the region. Forrest in the meantime would develop a plan. With Chalmers coming in to join Roddy, he could hold Wilson in place while Jackson worked his way in behind the enemy. It would be a bold plan. During a prisoner exchange discussion, Forrest had told an orderly of Wilson to inform the general that he would have a good spot for a battle, and that he would whip him if he brought his forces down. In many ways, this was just Forrest being Forrest. We've heard it before, obviously, Forrest talking a very big game, and in some cases, this trash talk is going to lead to interesting decisions in the field. So on the flip side of that, you also have some success in that. He's able to actually use this kind of bravado to force the capitulation of forces that, if not defeating him straight up, could at least have made for large amounts of casualties in his command, which is something he really just can't afford. Now that the battle was approaching, though, one has to wonder if Forrest realized he might have spoken a little too soon about the whipping part. On April 1st, Forrest would join Roddy and some militia who were skirmishing with Federal cavalry at a place called Ebenezer Church. It was here that Eli Long would throw a saber charge with the intention of pushing through the Confederates, who he believed were but a token command sent to delay them. Forrest, along with his escort and 2 companies of Kentucky cavalry, would draw revolvers, some with 2 in each hand, to meet the saber-charging Federals. Forrest, as usual, was in the thick of the fighting, throwing back the Union troops, taken by surprise of seeing competent enemy forces. The struggle was brief but fierce, at one point Forrest having to fight his way out, as would the Federal regimental commander Frank White. Upton would arrive and flank Forrest from his position, forcing a Confederate withdrawal back to the defenses of Selma. Frank Armstrong would meantime arrive, 1,400 men that could be added to his legion. But where was Red Jackson? Well, Forrest had sent a courier who had fallen into Federal hands. Much like McClellan before South Mountain, Wilson had an excellent idea of where all the Confederate forces were now. What was more, he would have a civilian who would mention that he had helped to improve the Selma defenses, so actionable intel. Wilson would be able to go into the upcoming fight with a good idea of how the city was going to be defended. This also should give you a pretty good idea of how the war has been progressing. Not everybody in Alabama is going to be pro-Confederate. Remember, famously, there's some Alabama regiments that are serving for the Union forces. So you have individuals who are going to want to see a more speedy conclusion, and therefore you're going to have somebody who's pro-Union who's going to be willing to talk, right? It's also, you have these couriers who are probably not as experienced, so they're going to fall into Federal hands pretty effectively. And then we also have, kind of on the flip side of that, you can also see how the Federal tactics have evolved. This raid that we saw back in 1863 into Mississippi kind of shows that these hard strikes deeper into Southern territory are going to be effective. And that is exactly what James Wilson is trying to do. Obviously, there was a little bit of a distraction. He's trying to make sure that Forrest is on the back foot. There had already been kind of a case study with lesser forces to really display how this could be effective. And now it's being used against the best that the Confederacy has, especially in this region, in Nathan Bedford Forrest, and is also proving to be successful. Eli Long and his division would take the right flank with Upton and his command on the left. They would straddle the northern approach. The defenses of Selma had been built earlier in the war, the city being vital to the war-making capability of the South. Pre-war estimates list the population at some 3,000, but during the war the city had risen to some 10,000, a common inflation for cities in the South. The city would sit on the northern side of the Alabama River, so a horseshoe of defenses would be laid out on this northern approach. Forrest would understand the desperate situation. He would call on militia and home guard to man the defenses, flanked by Armstrong and Roddy's commands. Anyone who could be used in the defense was pressed into the command. April 2nd would see the battle open with an exchange of artillery fire. Eli Long would reportedly see his command face some activity to his rear. Could this be the remainder of the Confederate forces? Reportedly, there had been some conflicting orders that would be delaying the rest of the rebel horsemen. Long decided that given this presence, rather than withdraw, he would commence with the plan of attack. Upton, in the meantime, would launch his attack, the commands being able to use their Spencers to great effect. Casualties would start to stack up in Long's command, but the Union troopers were not going to be deterred. Long would be wounded, a round grazing him in the scalp. This would lead Mentee to take command. Mentee, if you recall, was famous for his saber brigade, so an aggressive battlefield leader. They would take the outer defenses, the attackers too much for even Forrest veterans, seeing themselves outnumbered. The rebels would retreat to the inner defense lines. Many prisoners were taken before they could get there, the effect of the superior firepower really on display. Upton would also be seeing success, Roddy's defenders falling back to the second line held by Crossland's Kentucky Brigade. Wilson would lead the assault personally, his horse being mortally wounded in the fighting. The attempt on the inner line would require some regrouping, artillery proving some support, before a renewed attack breaks down the Confederate defenders. House-to-house fighting would erupt as nightfall would see the action continue. Union troops would commence destruction and plundering of the city in the meantime. With the Confederates pushed out, some Federals would celebrate, and thus, like other cases such as Columbia, this would result in some looting of the town. Forrest would break out and ride north, looking to meet up with the remainder of his command. In the process, the ever-warlike Forrest would cut his way out of Union troops blocking his way. Reportedly, Forrest would come across some Union marauders who brutalized some civilians. He would learn of the whereabouts of a scouting party which would be attacked and treated to no quarter. Surprisingly, Forrest would not engage in this action in a similar kind of style to Fort Pillow. Whether the escort command was really looking out for his safety or not is an interesting question. Obviously, you had extreme negative press after Fort Pillow. There's indication that Forrest, during that action, was not himself. He might have been suffering from a concussion, but he also behaves very strangely in that he does not go in with the first wave there. So you have this plausible deniability. And again, he's not present when members of his escort are going to perform this action, so then he has plausible deniability again. Not saying it's necessarily one or the other, but it is an interesting case against Forrest, and you kind of see the pattern with the two actions, and a lot of people point to that as being, Forrest is kind of a complicated character already, but we can kind of see how he's setting himself up so, at the very least, he can respond to the negative press. In the Battle of Selma, the Union troops had lost some 359 total casualties compared to some 2,700 rebels. Now, these numbers might be a little misleading as there was a great deal of captured men. Remember, too, that many civilians had been pressed into service, and as the defenders broke, they obviously surrendered. Edward Winslow, in the meantime, would take charge of the destruction. Not only would the works be systematically destroyed, but Wilson would also be able to resupply with captured stores. Some order would be restored, as Wilson would pause to complete the work. The Federal cavalry leader would treat with Forrest on the 7th. During this meeting, Forrest would admit to Wilson that this was the first time he had been truly beaten in battle. Prisoner exchange was the purpose of the meeting. Wilson and Forrest would continue correspondences after the war. April 9th would see Wilson begin to depart Selma. For those of you who are students of the war, or just know dates, you might want to remember that one. Confederates under Abraham Buford would skirmish as the column made its way to Montgomery. Any Confederate defenders would withdraw to Columbus, Georgia, until the town was surrendered by the citizens and occupied. Wilson would continue on, despite smaller-scale battles at West Point and Columbus, and make his way into Georgia proper. The raid was a complete success. Never had Forrest been so thoroughly bested. Wilson had gotten the jump on the rebels, and then, in very Forrest fashion, had beaten him before a concentration of forces. While this is an event that gets overshadowed by events abroad, but also with the Russo and Garrison raids, it could be one of the greatest cavalry raids of the war. So we'll go ahead and pause there. This week we had Jefferson Davis signing into law black soldiers to serve for the Confederacy. While two companies will be formed, it is dubious as to if they played any role in the war, as it is rapidly coming to a close. We also launched Wilson's Selma raid. Forrest has been beaten, the veil of invincibility lifted. Next week, we need to head to the Carolinas. Amongst other things, we need to have a sort of curtain call for the sub-theater of the war. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.